Until the spring of 1980, Mount St. Helens was a true jewel of the American Pacific Northwest. It was called the Mount Fuji of America for its nearly perfect conical shape and majestic snowcap, which was reflected in the crystal-clear waters of Spirit Lake. It was a place of pilgrimage for tourists, climbers, and nature lovers. No one who pitched tents at the foot of the mountain wanted to believe that this picturesque peak was actually the top of a colossal powder keg. St. Helens had been dormant for more than 120 years, and entire generations had grown up considering it merely a beautiful backdrop for photographs, not an active stratovolcano. But on March 20, 1980, the peaceful life of the region ended. Seismographs recorded a magnitude 4.2 earthquake. It was the first signal that the magma beneath the mountain had begun to move. Over the following weeks, the mountain literally began to come alive. First, there was a small emission of steam and ash that punched a neat hole in the glacier at the summit. Authorities began to slowly realize the scale of the threat, establishing exclusion zones. But the mountain was preparing something far stranger than a typical eruption. By mid-April, scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, noticed an anomaly that horrified them. The northern slope of the mountain had begun to deform. Under the pressure of rising magma, the slope began to bulge outward, forming a giant protrusion. This icy wall grew at an incredible rate, about 5 feet, 1.5 meters per day. The mountain was literally inflating before their eyes, becoming like a coiled spring or a giant hernia ready to burst at any moment. Geologists understood. The north face had become critically unstable. Despite the clear danger, the situation turned into a strange media circus. Thousands of people flocked to the edges of the danger zone to watch the show. The most vivid symbol of this resistance was 83-year-old Harry Truman, owner of a lodge at Spirit Lake, who flatly refused to evacuate. "This mountain is part of me, and I'm part of the mountain," he told reporters, sipping a cocktail surrounded by his 16 cats. His stubbornness made him a national hero, but for scientists like young David Johnston, Harry was a walking dead man. Johnston and his colleagues worked to the limit of their strength, knowing that the mountain no longer followed the laws of statistics. By early May, the tension had reached its climax. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, and instruments recorded thousands of micro-earthquakes. St. Helens had become a ticking time bomb, and the whole world, holding its breath, waited for the fuse to blow. No one, not even the most experienced volcanologists, could have imagined that the denouement would be so violent. Sunday, May 18, 1980, began as a perfectly quiet and sunny morning. At 7 a.m., young volcanologist David Johnston, stationed at the Coldwater 2 observation post 6 miles from the summit, radioed in standard data on the mountain's status. At that moment, there was no sign that an hour and a half later, this location would become the epicenter of hell. The mountain appeared motionless, but beneath its northern slope, the giant bulge, which had inflated by 450 feet, 140 meters, was holding on by a thread. At 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck deep beneath the summit. This was the final click of the detonator. In that same second, the northern slope of Mount St. Helens, which had become critically unstable due to magma pressure, simply ceased to exist as part of the mountain. What happened next entered geology textbooks as the largest landslide in recorded history. A massive block of rock, nearly 0.7 cubic miles in volume, broke loose and surged into the Toutle River Valley at 155 miles per hour, 250 km/h. The mountain literally flung open, exposing its incandescent interior. Imagine a giant champagne bottle with its neck suddenly smashed off. The pressure inside the volcano was hundreds of times higher than atmospheric pressure. As soon as the rock cork vanished, superheated water and gases within the magma expanded instantaneously, turning into steam. A massive lateral blast occurred. This was a unique phenomenon. The energy did not go upward through the crater, but struck horizontally, turning the mountain into a giant cannon loaded with red-hot stone and ice. David Johnston managed to press his radio button and scream his final words. "Vancouver! Vancouver! This is it!" His signal cut off a fraction of a second later. The shock wave traveled faster than sound, overtaking the landslide. A massive volume of rock and ice crashed into Spirit Lake, raising a wave 850 feet, 260 meters high, which instantly wiped Harry Truman's lodge and all life around it off the face of the earth. In a matter of seconds, the summit of St. Helens dropped 1,300 feet, 400 meters, in height, transforming from a sharp peak into a gaping horseshoe. A cloud of ash and gas began to rise into the stratosphere, but the primary blow hit the forest. Century-old fir trees as tall as 10-story buildings snapped like dry matches under the force of the scorching wind. The peaceful landscape of Washington State was transformed into a gray, lifeless wasteland in 15 seconds. On this morning, time stopped forever for many, and the world saw that even the most majestic mountain can turn to dust in an instant. The lateral blast of Mount St. Helens was an event of such magnitude that it literally rewrote the laws of volcanology. A searing mixture of gas, ash, and rock fragments, known as a pyroclastic flow, erupted from the side breach at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, 1,000 km/h. The temperature of this deadly cloud reached 660 degrees Fahrenheit, 350 degrees Celsius. Within 6 miles, 10 kilometers of the volcano, absolutely nothing survived. This area, later dubbed the direct blast zone, was transformed into a lifeless lunar landscape where even the soil was stripped down to the bedrock. In the next zone, extending out 19 miles, 30 kilometers, the shockwave toppled over 4 billion board feet of timber. Giant firs and Douglas firs that had stood for centuries were laid out in neat rows like matchsticks, all pointing away from the blast. It was an industrial scale of destruction produced by nature in just a few minutes. A fascinating and terrifying phenomenon was the acoustic shadow zone. The roar of the explosion was heard in British Columbia and Montana, hundreds of miles from the mountain. Yet people just 30-40 miles away heard nothing but a strange rustling. The sound waves passed over their heads, leaving them in a haunting silence while the sky above them rapidly turned pitch black. By 9 a.m., a massive column of ash had risen 15 miles, 25 kilometers, into the sky, reaching the stratosphere. The sun vanished. In cities like Yakima and Spokane to the east, total darkness fell in the middle of the day. Streetlights triggered automatically, but their glow could not penetrate the dense curtain of gray dust. Birds went silent, and livestock huddled to the ground in terror, choking on the microscopic particles of volcanic glass that made up the ash. This ash was not like soft dust from a campfire. It consisted of microscopic shards of obsidian that instantly crippled car engines by clogging air filters and caused short circuits in power grids. Traffic on interstate highways ground to a halt. Thousands of people found themselves trapped in their cars, afraid to step outside. In the coming hours and days, the gray snow covered 11 U.S. states and parts of Canada. By evening, the ash plume reached the Great Lakes, and within 2 weeks, it had circled the globe. The entire world saw that a local eruption in Washington State had become a global event. America was plunged into a gray apocalypse, where the familiar world disappeared under a layer of acrid, heavy dust, and once blue rivers turned into boiling torrents of mud and debris, carrying death to everything in their path. Behind the dry statistics, 57 dead, hundreds of destroyed homes, and thousands of miles of ruined roads, lie stories of incredible courage and tragic coincidences. The eruption of St. Helens did not choose its victims. Among them were scientists who knew the risks and casual tourists who happened to be too close. The most famous and selfless story was that of Robert Landsberg, a 48-year-old freelance photographer from Portland. On that fateful morning, he was only a few miles from the summit. When the mountain exploded, Robert instantly realized that escaping the pyroclastic flow rushing toward him at the speed of sound was impossible. Instead of running in panic, he continued to shoot. He captured the approaching wall of ash, and when he realized no time was left, he carefully rewound the film, put the camera in its case, placed it in his backpack, and lay on top of it with his body. His remains were found 17 days later, but thanks to his final act, the world saw those very images, the final seconds of life in the face of imminent death. No less tragic was the fate of young geologist David Johnston. He was one of those who insistently warned authorities about the need to expand the exclusion zone, risking his reputation. That Sunday, he was covering for a colleague at the observation post. David knew that the bulge on the slope could collapse, but he believed that science could help save thousands of lives. His body was never found. All that remained of his post was the mangled frame of a trailer and a few scientific instruments buried under meters of superheated soil. Today, this site is called Johnston Ridge, in honor of the man who gave his life for the chance to warn others. These people were not just victims of the elements. They were witnesses who fulfilled their duty to humanity until their last breath. Yet, there were those who died due to their own stubbornness or underestimation of nature. Old Harry Truman, who had become a national celebrity, remained under a 150-foot layer of ash and debris in his lodge by Spirit Lake. His legendary loyalty to his home made him a symbol of the American pioneer spirit. But the price of that loyalty was absolute. The eruption also claimed the lives of families who had come for a weekend of fishing or picnicking, believing they were safe outside official barriers. Nature showed that its safe zones do not align with human maps. The total economic damage exceeded $1 billion, but it was these lost lives, these unfinished stories, and these abandoned cameras that became the heaviest reminder of that morning. St. Helens left behind not just mountains of ash, but deep scars in the souls of those who lost loved ones, and in the memory of a nation that realized its impotence before the Earth's fury. Immediately after the eruption on May 18, 1980, the area around St. Helens looked like a set for a movie about nuclear winter. Scientists predicted that life would return to this gray desert only after decades, and full-fledged forests would not grow for at least a century. But nature provided another surprise, this time a hopeful one. Just a few weeks after the catastrophe, the first sprouts of fireweed and lupine pushed through the thick layer of ash. It turned out that some plants and small animals, such as pocket gophers and salamanders, had survived in underground burrows or under thick layers of snow that had not yet melted in shaded ravines at the time of the blast. These biological remnants became the foundation for an incredible recovery. Today, St. Helens is the world's largest natural laboratory, where biologists observe how life literally reclaims territory from death, turning gray dust into fertile soil. The scientific legacy of the eruption cannot be overstated. Before 1980, volcanology was largely a theoretical discipline. St. Helens gave scientists their first opportunity to study a lateral blast and giant landslides in detail. This led to the creation of new volcano monitoring protocols worldwide. Super-sensitive GPS sensors and laser systems were developed, capable of detecting the slightest changes in a mountain's shape, similar to the bulge that was once not taken seriously. Now, if any of the dormant giants in the Cascade Range, whether Mount Rainier or Mount Hood, begins to show activity, humanity will have a much better chance for a timely evacuation. St. Helens taught us that volcanoes are not just mountains, but living, breathing systems that require constant attention and respect. Today, Mount St. Helens remains a monument to the power of nature. Its summit, missing its symmetrical dome, reminds us of how fragile our world is in the face of geological processes. Thousands of fallen tree trunks still float in Spirit Lake, forming a giant wooden carpet, while the dead forests in the blast zone stand like ghostly silver skeletons amidst lush young greenery. This site has become a national monument, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year to witness the triumph of life over destruction. The story of St. Helens in 1980 is not just a tale of death and chaos, but an inspiring example of Earth's resilience. It reminds us that after the most terrifying explosion, morning always comes, and from the deepest ash, a first green leaf will eventually break through, signaling the beginning of a new era.